Alright, so what's going on, people? This is your boy, this is Doc Luch, um, coming back with some tutorials for you. So I'm going to try to run this for as long as I can. I'm going to try to do as many of these tutorials as possible. I was a beginner once, I had no clue what I was doing, so I hope I could really be helpful to y'all. This video is going to be on how to EQ, well, anything really. It doesn't really have to be any particular instrument or a vocal. The idea is that an EQ is going to do the same thing no matter what you're trying to do. So the way you use it may change, but the basics of how it functions are still the same and are going to apply, the majority being like 98-99% of the time. There's only a few times where those things will change, but we're going to get into the basics right now. So for starters, right now I'm in FL Studio, and once again, you know, it doesn't matter what EQ you have or what DAW you're running, it's all the same thing. It doesn't matter what software you have, all EQs work the same, so it doesn't matter what you're running. Now, for the sake of, you know, just giggles and laughs or whatever, I'm running FL Studio, and I'm going to be using the stock plugins. I actually like FL Studio, but I'm just doing the stock ones just because, well, I know a lot of people aren't going to have a lot of the stuff that I have. I need to go with one that everyone probably more than likely will have, or something of that nature. But once again, if you're not using FL, it really doesn't matter because they all work exactly the same. So all EQs have basically the same things. You're going to have a low pass, a band pass, or it'll be a bell curve, a high pass, a low shelf, high shelf. Like, these are all things you're going to see all the time, but they all have different purposes, and we're going to run through what they do right now. So I'm going to use the actual sample as the, well, actually I'm on the kick, so we'll do it with the kick. If I play this kick right here, we're going to first talk about what we have it set to as a high pass. Now with the high pass filter, what that does, you can already probably hear it, but I'll let you hear it. What it does is it cuts off all the lower frequencies and only lets the higher ones pass through. That's what a high pass filter does. Now why this is important is because, for example, when you have something like sub bass, your kick sometimes will interfere with your sub bass because the kick and the sub bass rattle in the same place. So the whole point of the high pass in this particular instance is to roll off enough of that kick to where it's not hitting down to 20 hertz where your sub bass is rolling off from. This is also important when you're mixing vocals. Like, for example, you know, the human voice and the ear in general can hear from 20 to 20,000 hertz, hence the 20 and 20,000. It goes 10K, but there should be 20,000 right there. That's what the human ear can hear. And just because you can't hear the sub frequencies in our voices, they're there. Your dog can hear it, but we can't. So because we can't, and we don't need those noises, you cut them off with the high pass filter. That's what we're doing. We're cutting off any frequencies that either A, we can't hear, or B, are distorting the mix. So for example, like with the vocal, somewhere around, normally around like 60 to 50 hertz for me normally is about a good cutoff on a vocal. That's whenever you normally, from normal male vocals, I record a lot of rap, but of course that's going to change depending on who you're recording. But that's where the normal cutoff is. And basically what that means is that you can't hear any difference really at all. But what you're doing is you're cutting off enough of that lower frequency so you can basically have more headroom for volume because there's less noise that you're actually allowing to pass through the filter. Same thing works on the top. You have a low pass filter. It does the same exact thing but in the opposite direction. Instead of cutting off the lows, it cuts off highs. It only lets lows pass through. So once again, thinned it out. You can't even hear it anymore really. Now we're thickening it up again because we're putting the highs back into the kick. And once again, it got all its air back around about 13,000 in this case. That's where this kick gets all its air, where you can hear its full vibrance. Anything above that is just too much. It's not necessary. And if you look at the EQ, you can see the colors vibrating all the way up. They're going all the way up to the 20,000. So all that extra hertage that we can't hear anyway, it's just a good thing to do just to cut it off. So that's how that low pass works. So the low pass is used for cutting off the higher frequencies that you don't need, and your low pass is for cutting off the lower frequencies you don't need. Now once again, to break it down one more time for you, basically what we're doing is we're trying to make sure that we don't have instruments or vocals clashing with each other in frequencies where other instruments stand out better, especially when it comes to sub bass and kicks in the bottom end of your vocal. For example, also at the top end of your vocal, you have your hi-hats and your stuff like that, your cymbals that really shine around 8 to 13, 20, 15K, whatever. You don't want your vocal stretching out that far if it doesn't have to. You can roll off a little bit of that upper frequency as long as you're not cutting off any of the vocal sound. You just roll off a little bit of it just to help those hi-hats and cymbals and things stand out a little bit more. Like doing all these cutoffs with the low pass and the high pass filters really do make a huge difference in your mix. Now, the other one you're normally going to run into is what they call is a band pass, or it'll be a bell curve or something. So if I put this kick in the mix, we'll put this song on. If I go to the cue and I pick one, it thickened it up. Now this other knob down here, and it's the same on all EQs. They all do the same thing, but the curves might change how much they can curve, but you could change the amount of frequency that you're affecting. And what I do is I scan and I listen for something. Oopsie. It's too much. Okay. See, like right there, like I got a nice little thump. And what you do is you drag it back down, but not to 0. And what it's going to do is it's just going to help it stand out in the mix a little bit more. I'll go up here. So when it's a little bit higher up to give the kick a little more treble. Oopsie. Listen before. The kick is just hitting ever so harder, just a little bit, because those little peaks that we did right there, just enhancing a little bit in certain areas where it sounds good. You never want to do it where it sounds muddy. You can boost the frequencies a little bit where they sound good, but not where they sound bad. Now keep in mind that when you're boosting frequencies and you're raising volume, you can never raise the volume of an instrument louder than what its incoming volume was. So you want to make sure you're dragging your levelers down, your channel volumes, when you're doing this, because you don't want to add too much foreseeable volume, then it becomes louder than what the instrument was actually recorded at. It's the same thing with a vocal. Like if you're recording a vocal and the vocal's coming in at a certain volume, you can't, when the song is done being mixed, have the vocals being louder than what they came in at. It's going to be scratchy, distorted, it's not going to sound good. So this is something that just falls into play everywhere. But that's how you use a high pass, a low pass, and a bell pass or a band pass, whatever you want to call it, on an EQ. I tried to be a little bit descriptive here without going too far into it. But what you're going to do is you're just going to do this to everything. It's the same process. Sometimes you're going to have areas where you'll have an instrument where you might need to do a cut instead of a cut instead of a peak. Like a peak meaning like we're doing this, and then a cut meaning that you're dropping it down because maybe there's a frequency where something sounds really bad. Like for example, we'll do one. We'll go to the snare. We'll put an EQ in the snare here. do the high pass first. See right there, it just got all its fullness back in it, but we still rolled off a little bit of it, so it's not, you know, completely just hitting down to 20 hertz with that sub bass. Different kicks and hats and things, you know, they're gonna have different cutoff frequencies. We'll go to the top. We cut off all the highs we don't need. Let's get all the air back in it. Okay, that's got all the air back in it. So now we'll look for a place where it sounds kind of muddy, which is going to be around that 300 to 400 most of the time. And you don't want to scan too big of a section. See how that kind of sounds raunchy? It's got a nasty sounding thud to it. We'll take that frequency and we can drop it down. Just ever so slightly makes a change in the variation of way it sounds. And once again, if you want to do something like you want to do like a peak somewhere, we'll raise one of these up. Listen for something that sounds good in this range. That sounds pretty good. You can hear right there where it really just came clear to the mix at about 1.5 hertz boost. But once again, you got to remember that I already dropped my volumes on my levelers here on my channels, so I can compensate for the fact that I'm adding gains somewhere in a certain frequency. Some instruments just stand out better in different frequencies than others, and when you do these kind of things, it just helps the instrument stand out more. In your hi-hats, once again, the same thing will apply. The only difference in the hi-hats is the roll-off. You don't have to use a low pass in this case. A lot of people like to use a a high shelf. And the high shelf basically just shelves off the frequencies, levels them out. And if you use the bell curve here, all it's going to do is it's going to change the amount of curve that's occurring. As you can see, it's going to make them brighter. You don't want to do it too much in the highs because you don't want to, you know, make anything sound blary and nasty. But as you can see, just that little bit right there at the top end. If you wanted to, you could. Now, I'm not really a fan of doing this. I still prefer to use a low pass at the top, simply because of mastering purposes, because when you get to mastering, you want to have all the headroom that you can. And granted, I'm not going to be able to roll much off. You know, it's going to be basically rolling off anything basically over 20,000 hertz, and you can't hear that stuff anyway. You know, you're rolling off as much as you can. Like, I got the cutoff right here at about, what are we at? We're at 17,000 something hertz. You know, it's only a small little cutoff, but at the same time it does help. And once again, the same thing applies on the bottom. You have your high pass filter. We don't want to thin it out, but so about right there I can hear it all come back in. This one actually comes down kind of low at about 50, 48 is when you can really hear it all just kind of come back in. You know, some hats are going to be higher, some are going to, you know, it depends on the instrument, it depends on the way it was recorded. Things are going to change even from hat to hat or cymbal to cymbal. Different samples are going to change, you know, where your cutoffs are going to be, where it sounds good, where it doesn't. But in general, for anything, even vocals, your mud range is from around 300 to like, or I should say like 200 to like maybe 400, 500, and then 600 and up is more like the mid-range, like, you know, MIDI sound. Well, maybe 7 and up is more like the MIDI range sound. And then the presence range and like most things is about 2 to 8K. That's where you get the most vibrance, especially in the human voice. But you know, you're looking to cut out some mud and you're looking to boost the presence. That's basically what you're looking to do. Different instruments have a different presence range depending on the instrument. For example, in the snare, the presence range We had a peak. We did a peaking where we did a little bit of a notch here at 730 hertz. So at 730 hertz, it has good presence in this particular snare. I'm stressing there's treble presence in there, like it's going to enhance the highs of it, but it just made it sound more solid. It made it hit harder in the mix, hits through the mix. When you raise frequencies like this, it helps things hit through the mix so they can be heard better. And the high pass and low pass do the same thing because it stops the instruments from getting so distorted because you don't have all those frequencies rolling off that are blaring with other instruments that are just making everything just sound really nasty. Now, on certain instruments, like I said, most of this stuff applies most of the time, like 98, 99% of the time. Now, for example, like one instance where the high pass filter rule won't apply, but the low pass filter still will, is on sub bass. Because, like I said, sometimes these rules do bend. Now, the reason is because on sub bass, and this is just like a particular genre, this varies from genre and things like that, but particularly in hip hop, everybody loves to have that sub bass in it. So a lot of the times you'll have sub bass kicks, or there'll be kicks with sub bass. In this case, I have a kick with sub bass, so I rolled off some of the kick to not vibrate with the sub bass. But when you have sub bass or a sub bass kick, say if you just have a sub bass kick, you don't want to put a high pass filter. You don't want to cut anything off. I know it's going to take up a lot of frequency, volume and things like that, and it's going to make a little bit of distortion. But in hip hop, people love that. So, for example, when it comes to bass, I have my bass here. And with the bass, what you want to do is, because we don't want to cut off any of that low, because we really want that rattle, we want to hear all that bass, we're going to put the low pass around, normally people say around 250, but what I always say is just listen to your bass. You don't want to cut anything away from it. Even your bass has a little bit of treble in it. You can hear right there where we just kind of thinned it out. The rule they say is about 250, but I mean sometimes 250 cuts off some of the higher bass notes, so I always say it's around maybe 250 to 350. But basic rule of thumb is, if you aren't sure because you're really not hearing that much of a difference, a good rule of thumb is to go with that 250. But like I said, sometimes when you have bass notes that are a little bit higher in octave, having that 250 cutoff is a little bit too low and you drowned out some of those notes. In this case, I'm not hearing it, so the 250 cutoff should be just fine. So as you can see, the little purple vibrates upward. As a matter of fact, that's why I like FL Studio, especially for this tutorial, because all the instruments have that, or all the mix, everything, all the EQs, they give you that vibrance. And you can see where everything's actually landing. You can see where the frequencies hit the hardest. So it helps, especially with the learning curve, when you're trying to get used to using an EQ. So yeah, but for example, like with a sub bass, you don't want to have a high pass filter. So this is where like the rule can change. If we were talking about something like country music or something like that, where you have like bass guitars and stuff like that, and you don't want to have all that extra rumbling bass at the bottom, yeah, then you would use a high pass. But for something like hip hop, where you want a lot of raunchy, nasty, rattling, loud bass, you really don't want to cut anything off because you want all that sound to rattle up. But at the same time, you want to put a low pass around 250 to 350, depending on how high up your bass notes are going. Just listen for the clarity in your bass notes as well. Everything has clarity. Everything, you just got to listen for it. You don't want to kill any of the clarity in your mix. But you don't want to have bass rattling off too high, because it's going to start to affect the mid-range instruments like vocals, snares, things like that. You don't want it to do that. Your pianos, your other instruments, etc. And then in terms of the sample here, it's the same thing. I mean, with the sample, I would just put like a basic EQ on it. And we'll do a high pass in the front because we don't want it to rattle with anything too much on the bottom. Once again, we're going to listen, we'll thin it out, and then we'll drag it back down until it gets whole again. So somewhere around there, it sounds like it's got its wholeness back. You got to keep in mind, guys, that I'm doing this, and gals, that I'm doing this through my studio phones and not using my studio monitors, so it's a lot harder for me to hear everything clearly. If I was doing this through my Rocket 5s and not listening through my Audio-Technica headset, then I'd be able to get a better idea of what I'm listening for. But you guys get the general idea. You already know what we're listening for in terms of cutting off the lower frequencies and cutting off the higher ones. Same thing on the top, the low pass. You thin it out. We don't want to thin it out. We just want to get it all back in without cutting anything out. Sounds really clear right there. But it gets everything back about right over here. So we're looking at about, what is that, 15,000 K, a little bit over it. Somewhere around there it gets all its upper range back, where it's got all its clarity. We're not killing it. Then once again, if you want to search for areas that sound good, we could do that as well, because once again it helps things balance in the mix. So we'll use one of the bands. And keep in mind, I forgot to mention earlier, these bands, the numbers or the ranges that they actually affect. Like the 6 is going to affect more of like the 2 to 8K range. The 7 is the 8K and up. The 5 and the 4 are more the mids. The 3 is more the low mid. The 2 is like the bass area. But like for example, like if you take this one up here, which is more for like mid highs and highs, and you drag it down here, it's going to take out mid-high sound instead of a lower sound that you would be looking for in that section, if that makes sense, guys. So you want to use the band that's allocated to the section that it's allocated to drown out that particular frequency of sound. If you use another band in another section, it's not going to drown out the frequency you're looking for it to drown out. It's just going to drown out the frequencies that that particular band is meant to drown out. So just keep that in mind. I don't want to try to make that too complicating, but we'll go ahead and we'll listen. So like in this case, like there's a lot of mid heavy with the violins and cellos. So we'll go with the mid section. So we'll pick like the 5 or the 4. We'll go with the 5. We'll drag it up, and I'm going to thin it out so we don't affect too much of a section. We're going to listen. About right there, it sounds pretty good. We'll drag it back down and drag it back up till it really just clears out. You hear it just subtly come into the mix a little stronger. Really not hearing it that much because it's really not that much of a difference here. But I'll go to the 4. We'll do it over here. This is where the presence is really heavy. And you guys can see how it affects that section right there really heavy, but once I get over here, the effect is a little bit different. This 5 will affect better over here than the 4 will. That's my point about keeping the numbers where they should be with the bands. That sounds pretty good. And drag it back down, and then drag it up till you just hear it come out of the mix. You can hear it just like increase a little bit in volume or even out a little bit. Like you'll hear like a difference when you're dragging it. Like even right there, I don't know if you heard it, but the snare actually got brighter in the mix when I increased it right there. As funny as that sounds, but when you do these little adjustments, it allows other instruments to stand out better in the other places where you did the cuts and peaks to those as well. So it all makes the mix sound better. But right there, it actually balanced out the snare as well. It made the snare sit way better in the mix than it was before. But yeah, guys. You know, then once again, if we wanted to do some cuts, it'll make the sample sound a little more clear. That sounds pretty raunchy. Drag it just below 0. And once again, we're not trying to kill it, we're just trying to knock enough of the frequency out to where it doesn't stand out as much in the mix. So even right there, when I just did that little switch right there, you heard where the kick and the snare got a little bit more vibrant when I moved that little cut I did around a little bit. I don't know if you guys heard that, but it actually made an improvement, because once again, the cuts and the peaks are going to help the mix sit better as a whole together. That's what we're trying to do here. Once again, cutting off all the sounds that we don't need and boosting where it sounds good and cutting where it sounds bad. And if you keep up this process, it's just going to make the mix sound great. But that's the basic for the EQ and how you get it to work. So just leave your thoughts in your comments down below. If you have any questions further on this topic. I'll go deeper in another video. There's more things I want to talk about. I'm going to do videos on compression and limiting and other things as well. If you have a particular video that you want me to do, let me know. I plan on doing a lot of live videos. We'll do some Q&As. Hopefully get some sampling videos in, teach you guys how to sample. If you have any questions on musical chords or progressions or anything at all, just please let me know. I'd be more than happy to make videos on the stuff. This is Doc Luch. Peace.